The Countdown Cup was yet another addition to this epic journey known as Season 4 of the Overwatch League. It was pretty eventful to say the least, but now the ride has come to a close. Before prepping for the playoffs, let's take one final look back at how this stage went, and what better way to do so than by exploring it with some power rankings. In case you're new around here, my rankings work a little bit differently than what you consider the traditional way, I guess you could say. I primarily discuss full rankings involving all 20 teams, and each team will get a graphic that shows their placement, plus how many places they rose or fell compared to the Summer Showdown video. And big warning here, I put a lot of stock into how teams performed in this particular tournament. Sometimes I will go beyond that when it makes sense, but just know the primary thing I'm going off of is things like record, how teams played in their individual games, how they did in the qualifiers, the knockouts, or any other games that they might have played in. So if I place a team higher or lower than where you think they are skill-wise, just know that's likely why. If you're more of a regional rankings person, I also recommend staying around till the end of the video where I will briefly go over what my rankings would look like on that end. There's lots to talk about, so let's dive right into this. Starting off my list at the number 20 spot is none other than the LA Valiant. No surprise there, am I right? They were once again dreadful from start to finish in their qualifiers. Outside of some decent plays from time to time, they didn't show us much of anything at all. But again, who on earth is surprised? The Valiant were supposed to be terrible this year. Losing 12 straight maps isn't anything crazy. It's harsh to say, but that's kind of the truth. This is what we've come to expect from them. The 0-16 dream has become a reality. After 4 years, the Shanghai Dragons don't have to feel so lonely anymore. The winless team title is now shared. The rumors of this squad being happy to win even a single game this year were on the money. I want to say this was a disappointing year performance-wise, but it's hard to do so when this was literally expected out of them. Congrats on going 0-16. Very cool. Okay, now is where we get into some potential controversy, at least for those of you who don't take the context of this video in the right way. 19 is the Washington Justice. Allow me to explain. Please remember this is based off of their performance in this stage alone. They're not actually the second worst team in the league. That would be ridiculous to think that. But the fact of the matter remains is they got swept 3 times and only found success against the Vancouver Titans. And if we're being honest, they didn't even look that amazing in that game either. In what world does that not deserve a poor grade? They weren't good. I'm sorry, Justice fans, but you know me. I like to keep it real around here. I don't care what their schedule was. They are expected to show us more. You and I both know it. There is no reason why a team with this much talent should be getting swept against any sort of competent opponent. I expect more out of them. This type of performance warrants a bad rating. They showed pretty much no fight during this tournament aside from the Vancouver game. They lacked the killer instinct. They're still far too passive and ridden with silly mistakes. This is not what the Washington Justice represent, but here we are living through it. They better turn things around like right now. It has to come quick, because there is no way in hell they make it through the knockouts if they don't. Time to lock in, boys. At the number 18 spot, we have the Vancouver Titans, and for a lot of you, that will seem very strange. How could I have the Titans over the Justice when Washington literally beat them? Pretty bad, in fact. The Titans had a more impressive stage. They did more. They won more maps. Yeah, when comparing these two teams, they're in completely different tiers and it's not even close. But the fact of the matter remains is that the Titans crushed their expectations, unlike the Justice, who played way below them. Most of us assumed that the Titans at best could beat the Spitfire or at least take them to like a map 5. Not only did they take them to a map 5 in a competitive showing, but they also just absolutely destroyed the Boston Uprising. So not only did they look competitive in a good amount of their games, but they also played above what people thought of them by beating a team that nobody thought they'd be able to. Some of you might think, well, if we're going off that logic, maybe they deserve to be even a bit higher in the rankings, let's say. And I won't even argue with that. I think that's totally understandable. But my counter argument is what they pulled off in general isn't that special. Yeah, compared to what the Justice did, it seems like a pretty big achievement. But in reality, the Titans crushed a Boston squad who are struggling with the meta and were clearly more focused on Florida that week, and they almost beat a team that is just as bad as them, essentially. Not exactly the results that are worth bragging about, you know? I almost put them a little higher, but ultimately decided it didn't feel right because, yeah, they showed improvement, but nothing that warrants a major rank up of sorts. Titans fans at the very least, though, can be happy knowing that their team ended the year with some exciting results. They felt more competitive, and on top of it, they fulfilled the breadsticks meme. It's a shame there wasn't more time left in the year, because maybe then they could have given us a few more good performances before going out with a bang. Number 17. the London Spitfire. Kind of the same situation as Vancouver. They won their first and only game of the season this stage. There certainly was improvement compared to the Summer Showdown, but it's not anything crazy noticeable. You won a single game and you took 5 maps overall. There is literally a team who went winless this stage with more map wins. So it goes to show there are still steps that need to be taken. I appreciate London avoiding that 0-16 year. I was very pleased with how this team played around Shaxx. They played fairly well against Toronto, and Dallas for that matter, and of course they got a win on top of it. But they could have done better. They let maps slip away, and they just barely beat the Titans to begin with to get their ever so elusive first win. There were ups, but lots of downs too. Maybe next year can be different. You just gotta stay hopeful, London fans. If the Eternal can find success, maybe you can too. My 16 spot is where things continue to get weird, because I have the Hangzhou Spark. Why on earth would I rate a team who went 0-4 this stage at 16th? Well, it's because they showed better fighting spirit than the teams I have below them so far. As mentioned a few moments ago, they won more maps than the Spitfire, but also Vancouver and Washington. The Spark, who aren't in a great place overall currently, gave a challenge to all of their opposition at one point or another. People often forget they were close to sweeping the Seoul Dynasty, aka a stage finalist. They did alright for a winless team. The fact that they were in most games they played is more than London, Vancouver, and Washington can say. They pretty much could only beat up each other. An 0-4 stage was very close to being 2-2 for the Spark. But don't get me wrong, the Spark did not have a good showing overall. Nothing can change that 0-4 record. That alone automatically makes them a bottom-tier performer. And with the current state of the team along with the MCD drama, the Spark are in a concerning situation. They are practically limping into the knockout portion of the playoffs. It'll take a miracle for them to make it out on top. At 15th is the Boston Uprising. Their results were rather mediocre this time around. Things started off pretty good when they blew out Paris, but that's pretty much when they peaked. It was nothing but downhill afterwards. They took a map here and took a map there, but no opponent they came across truly found themselves sweating. And I mean, come on. Getting swept by Vancouver is unacceptable. That should almost always be a freebie opponent. Boston's understanding of the meta seemed to hurt them greatly. They stuck way too much to the Orisa comms. The flexibility was severely lacking. Their poor results nearly costed them a playoff opportunity. Let's just say that Boston are lucky that Florida had such a difficult schedule this tournament. Boston now find themselves as the lowest seed in the Western knockouts. Their road to the playoffs will officially be harder than anybody else's. But maybe that's what they need. Boston seem to play better when they have that underdog mentality going for them. But honestly, even if they don't manage to pull anything off, this is a somewhat successful bounce back year. All Boston fans are going to agree with me when I say that it's way better than their last 2 years combined. So no matter what happens, you guys can feel at least a little bit happy. There is something to look forward to heading into next year. Number 14. The Guangzhou Charge. See what an extra win can do for you? It obviously doesn't mean much considering they're still within the bottom 8, but still, the Charge had their best qualifier of the year as they just barely missed out on the knockouts. Had they taken care of business against the Spark a little sooner, maybe the Charge could have given their fans a fun way to end their year. Heck, in theory, they could have made the knockout playoffs had they somehow won the entire cup. Still though, the Charge did alright. The end result isn't what they wanted, but this was their first real stage where they felt like a decent team. While I'm sure some of it has to do with other teams not trying as hard here at the end of the season, the Charge genuinely seemed comfortable out there. Eileen's Hanzo and Choi Se-won's Tracer stole the show. Some of their other team members like Kariv and Rio also appeared to be in their element this time. Taking at least one map in every series was a first for them, but unfortunately, their wins of this stage aren't absurdly impressive, which is why I can't put them any higher than 14th in my rankings. Number 13. The Florida Mayhem. You could maybe argue they belong a spot below since the Charge won more games, and that's totally fair, but in my eyes, the Mayhem did more against stronger competition. A single victory isn't something to write home about, especially when it comes against a Boston team who weren't the greatest this time around. But to push the Atlanta Reign to a map 5 and look relatively competitive against Houston and LA is not something you should be overlooking. We're talking 2 tournament finalists in the Gladiators and Reign. The Mayhem showed me more with a greater strength of schedule. That's why I think they get ranked over the Charge performance-wise. They did what they could. Yaki stepped up to this monumental challenge of making a comeback, and he came real close to making it happen. It was hard carry after hard carry performance. It's a shame that the Mayhem couldn't do anything with it, but that's what happens when you have internal problems. You end up digging yourself into a hole most of the time. It saddens me greatly to know a team with this high of a ceiling won't even get a shot at the playoffs. The May Melee gave us all a lot of hope. But hey, at least Florida went down swinging. I wasn't expecting much from them after what they showed us during the Summer Showdown. They seemed just about ready to kick the bucket back then essentially, so good on them for going all out. Hopefully Season 5 can be a turnaround year. Number 12. The Houston Outlaws. These guys did okay. Nothing to write home about, but not the most pathetic thing I've ever seen either. They got 2 convincing wins this stage, so that's a plus, and I would even consider the Mayhem match a quality win, but at the same time, they got crushed in the other 2. It was an average stage. Putting them right around the halfway cutoff seems just about right. They clearly showed competence, but not enough to make you consider them a real threat. It's tough to overlook how little resistance they showcased in their losses. They don't ever seem to make good enough game plans to defeat the upper tier teams from North America. They had a chance to prove themselves against 2 finalists, but failed miserably both times. It's as if they're scared. Their big playmakers get outplayed by the opposition pretty much every single time. It was not a pretty look. Those glaring inconsistencies make this a mid-tier tournament showing. Number 11. The Paris Eternal. A very minuscule step back for your European underdogs this qualifier. They lost an extra game, had a tough time with this meta at times, and lost multiple heartbreakers at the same time. But guess what? They still made the knockouts even through all of those struggles. They showcased grit, determination, and adaptability. The only real bad performance they had was against Boston. Every other match was either a dub or a close loss. Doesn't sound too bad if you ask me. I absolutely loved the job that Naga and Dridro did in particular. They gave out some unreal levels of consistency. While they likely wouldn't have made Hawaii given how the Glads and Rain were playing, just the fact that they went down fighting is a great look. It's a real promising sign when you're a young underdog squad like this. It was only an average stage, but if Paris can be average in a meta they don't particularly love, that's a promising sign if you support this team. It gives you hope that maybe they'll have a chance of making some magic happen if the meta gets a little bit better or they continue improving coming into the playoffs. A showdown with the Justice is coming up in round 1 of the knockouts. It won't be easy, but there is upset potential there for sure. Let's see how they do. Taking us to the upper half of the rankings is the NYXL. New York fans can't be too mad about what their team put out there. They did what they had to in order to have some sort of shot at the knockouts, but they came up short against a superior opponent, and there's no shame in that. But even so, I can't exactly rate their overall performance absurdly high. 2-2 with a map differential of 0 is practically the definition of average. 10 is basically smack dab in the middle of the pack, so why not place them here? I appreciate what the NYXL did. They had a good hard-earned victory against Shanghai. That was a big highlight. While their opponents were definitely not going all out, the Dragons did push the NYXL anyway, and they responded every step of the way. And then some similar stuff came up in the knockouts. That was probably the closest 4-mapper I have seen in a very long time. That level of play is not something to take lightly. The New York Excelsior made the Chengdu Hunters sweat. You know, that team that was literally a single map away from taking the Countdown Cup title. That is what I'm looking for. If you're not going to have a crazy good stage, at least give me good showings against some top-notch competition. I can be proud of something like this. But of course, fighting spirit can only get you so far all on its own, which is why you kind of have to consider this a mid-tier level showing, hence why they come in at number 10 on this list. Number 9. The Toronto Defiant. Now here's a pleasant surprise. It was very unexpected to see this team go as far as they did. I definitely left this tournament feeling satisfied. They took care of business and they got some clutch wins against a rival team along the way. Sounds like a smashing success if you ask me. As I said in one of my previous videos earlier this week, there truly was only one blunder out of them this go around. The last 2 tournaments made me think this team was forever doomed to be mediocre. But it would seem I was mistaken. The pattern meant nothing. They needed a good qualifier to lock up a playoff opportunity, and they took care of business. When the pressure was on, they passed with flying colors. They showed levels of clutch we haven't seen since the beginning of this year. Pretty much everyone who played had at least one good showing during this month. Hisu and Lastro were true leaders pretty much the entire stage. That was the kind of constant playmaking they were missing before. This team put out a product to be proud of. I will happily give them a big-time bump up in the rankings. They deserve it. Number 8. The Dallas Fuel. You know, for a stage where they really weren't trying all that hard, it still wasn't that bad. Just one true blowout loss to their names, and they still somehow made the knockouts anyway. If you can still be competitive when it's not even your intention to do so, it's clear that you are simply built different. They still had the potential to be a top team this stage. That's something you should not undervalue. How can you still be reasonably decent when you're literally trying to not make Hawaii? Dallas did some hardcore experimenting with ball comps this stage and found mixed results. They were clutch against the likes of the Shock, the first go-around at least, but then they lost a close one to Paris. They were a little too inconsistent to be past that top 8 threshold. Not bad, but nowhere near a top tournament. Number 7. The Shanghai Dragons. Take a lot of what I said about Dallas and apply it here as well. Their tournament run through was practically the same. Shanghai also saw no reason to try in this tournament, so we saw them be way less dominant than usual. But guess what? The Dragons are still tough to beat even when they're not in top form. They had only one blowout loss to Philly, but that's only the true bad moment for them, really. It's pretty crazy to think that they can beat a stage finalist in Seoul and push a desperate New York team to their limits under these circumstances. Again, it's a fairly average qualifier on paper, but if you can still be in contention for a tournament when you literally are avoiding it on purpose, it's safe to say you're doing something right. The Dragons literally have to try to be bad. That is impressive. Sliding into the number 6 spot is the Philly Fusion. The end result for them was disappointing, but this will still be a pretty nice bounce back stage when we look back at it. The June Joust and Summer Showdown saw massive underperformance issues, so making it back to the knockouts is a fantastic step back in the right direction. They showed poise, they showed confidence, and most importantly, they won some big games convincingly. Trying or not, a 3-0 over Shanghai is no easy feat. It's only like the third time somebody has swept them the entire year. Philly for a while seemed to be back. They had great momentum going for themselves. EQO and Funny Astro finally found their groove. I thought that Hoppa played fairly well too. Everything was going great until they ran into Seoul. It is this one single team that destroyed all the confidence they possessed. The reverse sweep took away their very soul. It has become painfully clear that Philly can't handle adversity this year, and that's part of the reason they can't go any higher than 6th place. They played pretty well overall, but they lost arguably the 2 biggest matches of their tournament. They lacked the clutch factor and that killer instinct to deal the final blow. Although they had a good stage overall, the competitive nature at the crucial moments was lacking, unlike some of the other teams I rank above them. Starting off the top 5 is the San Francisco Shock. Back towards the top they go. They too had a pretty decent bounce back stage. This time around, there wasn't a single game that they weren't in. The level of play we have grown accustomed to from this franchise was back. Were they absurdly dominant? No. Were they getting the job done? Yes. That's definitely a step up compared to the Summer Showdown when they failed to even make the knockouts. They did a good job against some respectable rosters. There were a few quality wins in the mix, and the games they lost went the distance. They pushed the stage champion LA Gladiators to their limits. It could have been the Shock in Hawaii had one fight gone differently on Havana, or even Oasis, I guess you could say. Credit is rightfully deserved here. It was a solid overall outing. I gladly would have given them top 4 had they made Hawaii. I guess it just wasn't meant to be though. Number 4. The Seoul Dynasty. You did it. You broke the ultimate curse. For once, you were consistent in the qualifiers and the knockouts. Credit is due in a lot of different places. Gesture came back strong. Creative showed dominant performances, and the DPS continued to be as clutch as ever. I was genuinely impressed. They showed great responses to adversity. Multiple reverse sweeps and some close overall victories is something to be proud of. It's tough to see things end the way they did though. Not to sound like a jerk, but their tournament performance was kind of abysmal. Their game plan completely backfired on day 1, and after that they kind of were just boomed to the point where they were just going to get crushed no matter what. It's this, and the idea of having to pull off reverse sweeps in the first place that leave me a little unsatisfied still. Making a tournament is fantastic progress, but the cracks that showed are a little concerning. Heading into the number 3 spot is the Atlanta Reign. Back into top 3 status they go. They did a good job. A 4-0 stage and another trip to Hawaii sounds pretty good to me. It was nowhere close to perfect, but putting out that level of play with a tough schedule is impressive. And it's not like they played any bad teams. Florida, Houston, Dallas, LA, and a Toronto roster finally hitting their groove are all formidable. Don't forget that they somehow made top 3 in this tournament despite having issues with Pelican along the way. Sure, the other 2 tournament matches weren't super close in the end, but the Reign did what they had to. They beat Seoul, they got to winners finals, and they locked up a top 3 spot in the tournament, which means they automatically make the playoffs due to that bonus point. I have nothing to criticize or complain about. I guess I could tack off some points for not getting any further than losers finals, but that's really it. Sounds like a solid run overall. Number 2. the Chengdu Hunters, one of the few teams to not move in my rankings. What can I say? It was another great performance from a team who is truly starting to come into their own. It was even better than the Summer Showdown, if anything at all. Their qualifier was more dominant, and technically, they got a few maps closer to winning a tournament title. They were in it until the very end. They're the hottest team in APAC currently, and it's not particularly close. The only team they lost to the entire stage were the tournament champs, who, mind you, they pushed to their limits both times. Every other match, they were clearly in control for the most part. Leaf played like a madman to the point where he may have done enough to lock up the MVP award. Somebody else who deserves a shout out here is alexyOWL. His play has gotten better and better, which means a lot when considering that the Hunters nearly released him just a few months prior. This dude was a two-way player who was known as a Zarya specialist last year. To see him come in and play D.Va at such a high level is very special. Also was a rock for this team before he retired. alexyOWL had big shoes to fill, and yet he's handled the situation with grace. Chengdu fans can head into the playoffs feeling proud. Obviously, it sucks to come up short. The first tournament title in franchise history would have been nice. But at the very least, you can walk away knowing that the Hunters are in the playoffs automatically and have a ton of momentum going for themselves thanks to a really strong back half of the year. The Hunters are a threat. There's reason to have high hopes, especially if they can play with this kind of consistency. And last, but certainly not least, is the LA Gladiators, who take the #1 spot. The Glads played some excellent Overwatch. They were competitive, they were clutch, and they played up to their true potential, which is something you don't hear every day with this particular franchise. Historically, they have always found a way to choke. This is the first time where everything has actually gone right, but it makes sense. When you have superstar playmakers from top to bottom and incredible leadership, you very much should be in contention for some titles. Good on the Gladiators for living up to expectations for once. They lost one game and it was by a single map. Every match they won was either done so in convincing fashion or they clutched out some big time wins. That's the major factor aside from the tournament title that puts them so high. The crazy thing about this performance is their clutch factor was coming through in all of their biggest games of the stage. Whether it was the tournament title on the line or just making it to Hawaii, they never wasted any opportunities. The slip up against Atlanta is their only real blemish on a crazy good stage. Saying they were the #1 team this tournament performance-wise is well deserved. But that's pretty much everything I have to say about the Gladiators making it to the #1 spot, so that does it for the overall rankings. Here's a quick overview of the entire thing. Looking at this thing as a whole is kind of scuffed, I'll admit it. I don't even want to imagine what it feels like to look at this without any sort of context. The biggest winners of the rankings are quite easily the Shock, Defiant, Gladiators, and Fusion, who all jumped up, I believe, at least 5 spots compared to where I had them in the Summer Showdown. On the losing end of it, you of course have the Washington Justice, but also the Fuel and Dragons, who naturally got moved down because they weren't trying as hard. A few other noticeable losers include the Houston Outlaws and Hangzhou Spark, who dropped 4 spots each. Now to quickly highlight my separate regional rankings. For the first time this entire season, the Dallas Fuel and Shanghai Dragons are not #1. Neither in the top 3 of their respective regions for that matter. Pretty crazy, right? Other teams simply took advantage of the situation and had better overall performances. Some other things to take note of are Toronto cracking the top 5 in the West, the Justice being dead last in the West, the Fusion going from bottom 3 to top 3 in the East, and the Charge getting out of bottom 2 in the East for the first time this year. Many of the same winners and losers from my full rankings apply here as well. Philly, San Fran, the Gladiators, and Toronto rise way up. Shanghai, Dallas, Washington, and Houston go way down. Not gonna lie, splitting this into separate rankings doesn't make this look or feel any less scuffed. It's really weird, and I'm going to stand by that. But hey, it really do be like that sometimes. Obviously, if I did this strictly on who I think is the best, it would look a lot different. But I digress. There's no need to get into that. I've done my job, which means that this video is done. If you enjoyed it, hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel would help out a lot. This video in particular will likely spark a lot of discussion for obvious reasons, so I encourage you to leave your own power rankings down in the comments below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate your support, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.